Many thanks, Dina. I'll invite Q to join us.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Alan and Andrew and all of the organizers of this event for inviting me all the way from New York City. Again, my name is Quentin Walcott. All my friends and family, and I include all of you in that now, call me Q, so feel free to call me Q. I'm going to talk a little bit about, the war on terrorism and the impact that's had on my life and people in New York in terms of really doing anti-violence work with men around, working with women and violence against women and girls and creating alliances and partnerships. And I'm the co-executive director of Connect. And I want to really start off with that because the co-piece is really important. That I am co-executive director with a white woman in New York City. So we're really trying to demonstrate the ideas of, being an ally, what that means in multiple forms. We are allies in terms of race, we are allies in terms of gender, and also in terms of age. We have a 20-some-odd year age difference. And I start with that because I think that's at the very end what needs to happen in terms of really doing this work, that we have these unusual alliances and that we are in this practicing of really trying to figure out how to really work together. And my presentation is going to be slightly different. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, not because I'm really into myself, but I think my story is important in terms of looking at the landscape of this war on terrorism, this quote unquote this war on terrorism that we kind of experienced globally and also inwardly in the United States and in particular of New York City. I am one of two boys of a single mother in New York City, so that says a lot immediately. And I'm a product of New York City schools, public schools, from the first grade until college. And what's really interesting about this topic for me is that thinking about globalization, thinking about terrorism, thinking about domestic policy, domestic violence, and international policy, is that I was a student activist. So my organizing began as a student. The things that I organized on City University campus were really about this idea of, if you're from New York City, you've probably heard of this, but this idea of called open admissions. And open admissions was something that was available to New York City high schools, which are predominantly people of color and poor people, affording them an opportunity to go to City University, at least get into one four-year college in City University. And so this was a policy in City University, but once Black and Latino youth started going to college, they instituted tuition for the first time, all right? And they raised the standards, not that, those students cannot meet them, but they weren't prepared for them in the New York City high schools. So part of my work on college campuses really was to fight racism. And then I was also a community organizer. So the work I did in the community was really looking at racism again, but looking at it from a perspective of the fact that the United States has political prisoners. I know we don't talk about that in terms of a country, but that does exist. So I did a lot of work around, freeing Mumia Abu-Jamal, and also he was a United States political prisoner, and also looking and making the connection between his experiences and Adiba in terms of looking at how does a political prison exist, and what does that have to do with violence against women and girls. So when I learned first about Nelson Mandela and connecting that to Mumia Abu-Jamal and other Black and Puerto Rican political prisoners in the United States, that was my perspective, and looking at how on CUNY campuses, going back to CUNY campuses, is that we didn't have African studies, right? So the fight was to really, incorporate African studies in City University and have all of that kind of really related to my path into this work. So looking at it as a community organizer, as a student activist, so I understood oppression, I understood marginalization, I understood all of those things. And so for me, doing work around violence against women was a shift in, or expanding what I knew about, power and control, and this idea of domestic violence to me was really something really broader, but at the same time, it's really the same thing. So it's really about strategizing, about gaining and maintaining power and control, and using the different tactics of abuse to do that. So for me, it was really a quick shift into looking at, sexism and violence against women from a different perspective, because even in my other locations where I did organizing, all those things that exist, right? So what I really want to talk about is, this is about, my organization is Connect, right? And we do domestic violence and gender violence prevention work. And we started at the same time, post 9/11, right? Really, maybe 3 weeks after 9/11, we formed our organization. We were part of a larger organization. We spun off because our charge was to looking at prevention and what would that look like in New York City. And we're talking about New York City has 8 million residents. So our goal was to really kind of find a place in New York City where there was no violence in terms of prevention. And this is where, my previous backgrounds of organizing and activism really made sense, because what we did was we looked at the places where domestic violence incidents were the most in the city, and that happened to be central Brooklyn, and then also central Queens, and then South Bronx. But first starting in central Brooklyn, and where these incidents of domestic violence were taking place were also the places where there was the most police brutality in the city, right? I don't know if you all remember, the case of Amadou Diallo, about 1999. He was shot by the police in front of his doorway, 41 shots. It only took 19 to kill him, right, but 41 shots. So this was the same part of Brooklyn where there was the most domestic violence, it's police brutality, and it was also the highest incidence of HIV and AIDS. With young girls, black girls, 1 in 4 had HIV. And then the same area of Brooklyn was also the place where folks, particularly black men, who were re-entering their communities from being incarcerated. So this is the highest incidence. So if you think about all those little layers that were happening in that part of Brooklyn, it made sense that we kind of looked at, the intersection between race and gender violence, and all those things kind of took shape for me in terms of my role in shaping the organization that I'm with now. So one thing that we did when we first started Connect was that we didn't just kind of come in and say this is what should happen in this community. We really took community participation in developing our programs and services seriously. And so what was happening in New York City post 9/11, Islamophobia was a serious issue in New York City. Faith communities were, already surveilled, but the level of surveillance was increased, and that the issues around, the communities that we're working with, and this is New York City again, very diverse from block to block, a different culture, a different language, different ethnic needs and issues that were taking place amongst communities in Brooklyn. So the biggest fear for people at that time was state intervention. So if domestic violence was happening in that part of town, it was unlikely that it would be reported because of fear of deportation, poor relationships with the community and the police. And so we really developed our services around that. So the faith work that we do was really important, kind of really respecting that and realizing what are the issues that are connected with that, and making sure that, women and children were safe, and, men were held accountable in these communities without the presence of the system, the criminal legal system. So the other important thing from these street surveys that we did, and this is how we really basically developed our programs, standing in front of train stations, supermarkets, wherever people were, we were asking them questions about what were their attitudes around this, what were the obstacles to getting the help that they need. And so the other piece that was really important in connecting it again to my work and my introduction into this work was the idea that people felt that men and boys should be engaged in this process of protecting communities and from state violence, but then also to change the attitudes and belief systems towards women and girls that led to severe types of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So that's how we developed our services, looking at concentrating on faith communities and involving men and boys. And this is 2001. So we've been in that process for quite some time. So what else was happening in that time was that when there was some form of police brutality where young men of color were being shot by the police, and there was no unarmed men being shot by the police, and there was really no justice or really, holding the people who were doing the shooting, which were the police and the state, accountable. So we had to really kind of, approach this by looking at how do we organize communities to police themselves and find justice in different ways. And what we found to be really, really important was that where this war on terrorism, took shape in terms of, communities of faith, was that a lot of the time that we were using to really organize and engage men was spent through those who believe in Islamic traditions. They had to defend their religion and their belief systems. So what happened with that was that we would engage communities and, and do trainings and workshops and have these conversations, but they had to, spend a lot of their time proving that their faith beliefs were about peace and righteousness. So what that meant was that this idea of, being in an alliance with, women and girls and really transforming communities, individuals and communities, it was very difficult. So the idea of these other issues were more important. These other issues around violence and oppression were more important than the idea of, how can we come together and really, transform communities around violence against women and girls. So that was a real issue for us. And the other piece was that those in communities where all these other forms of violence and health issues and social justice issues were taking place, like women of color in particular that were victims and survivors of violence, they felt that, really, they didn't want to bring the same and police into their communities because of what was happening to black men and men of color in particular. But so what made that difficult for us was that they weren't getting the help that they need, and that was problematic because there was no other thing in place around community accountability outside of the criminal legal systems, which already poor relationships because of police brutality and just no real interest of police being in those communities. So it made our work very difficult, and this is all from this idea of the war on terror and its impact on communities of color, in particular in New York City. So we felt that we need to kind of create spaces where people can come together, and safe spaces where we could be in dialogue and really engage men in a particular type of way, where we had to kind of debunk all the issues around oppression, xenophobia, those particularly who were undocumented, all the experiences around that, because they felt powerless. And we also had to really, work with them and make them realize that men weren't the only ones that are experiencing racism and all these other issues, that the women in their lives were as well, and that they were also human beings. Because the hierarchy of like oppression would come into play, and men were the ones who were experiencing all this violence from communities and from structural oppression and systems, but not realizing that the women in their lives, the women and girls in their lives were experiencing the same things, and then we would go home because of this hopelessness that we felt and be abusive with our families as well. So those were some of the issues around looking at what was happening post 9/11, and as we were developing our work, how the war on terrorism really, impeded that. And, it really reminded me of some work I was doing last year about this time in Africa, and this idea of, working around gender-based violence and developing accountable practices, but that this work cannot be done if there's a conflict going on, right? So this idea that we can only engage through gender-based violence work when there is no conflict was really alarming to me, because the idea that, if we can really work with men, change attitudes and belief systems, that we can, and ally and be in partnership with women, that we can create, peace, the peace that we need to avoid conflict. So that was very, interesting to me. And it's the same in New York City. And I've spoke to many of you during lunch and throughout the last 2 days of this conference about the similarities of what's happening in your country and what's happening in my country, and in particular what's happening in New York City. So I just thought that, it was really important that we kind of recognize the similarities and figure out how can we move forward. And, just kind of stepping back, I did some work with the United Nations Human Rights Subcommission. I was part of an NGO, and I presented on racism and its racism's impact in the city university system, which goes back to my original organizing, and then also looking at how the state viewed men of color. In the Amadou Diallo situation, again, was where Police Commissioner Bratton, who's currently the police commissioner in New York City, ironically, my intervention was about racism and using, police using, weaponry in black communities in particular, and that they used the Amadou Diallo case of shooting someone 41 times as a way of enhancing the weaponry that police use in communities. So the idea was, rather than looking at why that shooting happened and the problems with structural racism, they wanted to use hollow tip bullets that explode on contact as a basis of not having to use 41 bullets to stop someone from an alleged crime, right? So, and for me, that was the beginning of how the war on terrorism, and as a blueprint of using, and which is what's been happening in the United States, is that the war on terrorism really militarized police precincts so that they were able to use different types of weapons, stronger, more powerful weapons. Their uniforms were really changed, more protective of themselves when they had these high-powered weaponry. So they use what was happening with Amadou Diallo in that case, and the fact that we've used the war on terror to kind of look at, spaces in New York City where they can enhance the police presence and militarize them and point it inwardly at, communities of color and black men in particular, and how that has an impact on when we're trying to organize communities around to become anti-violence in terms of intimate partner relationships, that all these things play a role in our inability to do that work. And I remember looking online and seeing a picture of a tank that was stationed in front of a pumpkin patch. And the basis for that town was to protect the pumpkin patch from terrorism. So, and that's some of the realities that are taking shape in the United States. And then thinking about, the summer of 2014 was a very violent summer for youth. I'm sure you've heard of the Trayvon Martin case. That didn't happen this year, but there was another case, similar to that, where in Ferguson, I'm sure you all have heard of Ferguson, what's going on there, and in terms of how the police response, pointed at, citizens who are resisting, police and state violence has been very, very problematic. And so what that does, again, in terms of when we're trying to work around intimate partner violence, and because of, structural violence, racism, and the trauma connected to that, this idea of terrorism, and the state using that as a way of keeping people, quote unquote, safe and creating danger in communities is, very problematic. And then there was a case in Staten Island, the Garner case, where the police, and this is Bratton, once again, who's become the new police commissioner under the new mayor in New York City. He implemented policies around stop and frisk, broken windows, where all of these things are low-level crimes that really end up in young people, particularly men, dying, right, from a simple stop or an illegal chokehold that is used. All these unconstitutional policies have been problematic in that. So, and I say all this to say is that, in the work, in terms of what was mentioned, in terms of, looking at domestic violence or gender-based violence in relationship to other forms of violence, it's important that we look at the intersections, right? Some of them are intersections, and things are just kind of laid on top of each other. Like I talked about what was happening in Brooklyn when we started, that we have to kind of find ways to look at, multiple issues at the same time. Because when we look at domestic violence, it's an isolated issue, of course, but we look at it as a connection to gun and gang violence. And a lot of the young people that we're working with in New York City, Harlem in particular, they witness violence in the home and they get involved with gun and gang violence because what they're not getting at home, they're getting through these groups and organizations. And not to put a judgment on them, but they say the same things we say is ultimately human service workers. Do you need a place to stay? Are you hungry? Do you have money in your pocket? But at a different cost. And usually the cost for that is violence against women and girls, and in that process. So I think that it's important just to close that the things that need to happen is that we have to really create these unusual alliances where we're working together, being in conversations, and that men and women are really truly working together and not showing the lip service of, oh, we need to do that or that should happen, and just be in our practice and be in the practice and to work things out as you go through it. Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot, right? Thank you, everyone. We have a few minutes now to kind of just talk a bit more about what we've been hearing and what we think about the commonalities that are across these different contexts in which we're working. So I wondered, do you have thoughts about what you've heard or questions to the other panelists?
Yes. Do you hear me? Yes, you hear me. One thing I think is very important and hearing you, the need to share more from south to south. I think there's many things happening. We tend to learn more or hear more from what's happening in the US, Canada, Europe, but not so much of what happens in the south in New York. We need to know more about the processes and the responses. I didn't mention how globalization also is a great possibility of sharing information, of sharing solidarity, and organizing collective response. And that has happened many times in the last years around issues in Uganda or this issue happening in Mexico. So many different situations. And I'm very sorry. When I talk about the need to stop, that includes me. I have another meeting overlapping this one, so I have to go to get the plane at 1:10. I have to leave, and I'm very sorry about that.
Okay. Thanks, Benna.
Thank you.
So who else? Reactions to what each other has said?
I didn't grab the mic from Dina. She insisted.
I like sharing.
so I just didn't want him to look like that. I was actually thinking of the ways in which the South and the North and the three other Southern contexts, I think what all of us said, and I am quite sure that is an idea that has come up again and again here, is that we can no longer think about men or masculinities except in the context of destabilizing the very idea of gender itself, both through other gender identities as well as caste, religion, class. And I think I found a very interesting disjuncture between the title of the panel, which is Globalization and Gender Injustice, and the ways in which actually each of the speakers talked about not so much gender injustice, which is a kind of an older way of thinking about the ways in which globalization excludes women, but more in terms of how globalization produces new nodes of production of masculinities and femininities, some of which are empowering and some not. So just one last point, for example, which would be very illustrative, is that both I and Dina talked about the mobile phone as a mode of violently controlling women. But of course, in India, the mobile phone is also seen, and this must be taken very seriously, as a moment or a space of incredible empowerment for women. So you will find that the traditional village elders, the patriarchal village elders, are trying to ban young women from using mobile phones. More interestingly, in Punjab, the Women's Commission came up with a suggestion that daughters-in-law should not have mobile phones, because when they have mobile phones, they keep in touch with their natal families and don't learn to adjust, which is an Indian word in all Indian languages. You adjust to your parent, the home of your parents-in-law, and the mobile phone gives them an escape from that. So I think we also should emphasize the ways in which every moment of hazard is also a moment of empowerment, and I think that did come out from all of us.
I just want to add, thank you, that was very well put, and I want to add on the mobile thing how I think perhaps this illustrates the very specific terrains each of us inhabit. So given the way in which, for want of anything better, neoliberal developmentalism is just the way I'm putting it right now. But mobiles are very seen very positively in public discourse in Bangladesh. It's very mobile banking, mobile ladies. Mobiles are good for women as far as the Bangladeshi context is concerned. And people aren't talking about sexual harassment that goes on through mobiles or this whole video thing. So mobiles have a really particularly positive valence within the developmentalist sort of narrative that shapes a lot of the understandings of what is positive and what is not in there. So, yeah. Thank you.
Q, any reactions?
Yeah, I think mobile devices, I think just like social media have a positive and a negative aspect to them. And in terms of, campaigns that, go online, some of them are very helpful because it expands the audience. Some of them can become distractions, because I'm just thinking about like what's been happening in the United States in terms of the NFL and domestic violence, how that was really, it was trended, went viral, and it also really was a distraction from some of the things that I mentioned about what was happening during the summertime in terms of what was going on in Ferguson, what was happening in Staten Island in terms of these state pieces around violence. So it's really important to kind of put that in perspective and always kind of look at how it can be a tool positively or negatively. So mobile devices are, really important and to have access. But then I think about in New York City, there's an organization called Holla Back, and they use mobile devices to take snapshots of people who are harassing women in the streets. I remember when I first came out, I was really kind of concerned about it because, well, you take a picture of someone who's harassing you, then it could either exacerbate the violence, so it's really, everything is kind of a pro and con, and we got to really figure out how we can use media from, the presentations from yesterday in terms of using multimedia as tools of really having some of these conversations and transforming spaces around violence.
Yeah. I was very struck by Benno's kind of metaphor of the machine that we're trapped in, around, which is organized by violence and has deep roots in history in terms of colonialism, etc., those violent roots. But with it, thinking about the contradictions or the fractures or fissures within that machine that creates openings for work. We actually have very little time, but let's take a couple of questions from the audience just to allow some interaction, comments from people in the crowd. Very hard to see, actually. Any hands? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your words. In listening, Joe says I should stand up. In listening to your comments, I was wondering if I learned about not just talking about the individual aggression when a man either assaults or harasses women, and taking into a context of this globalization, whether it be in Bangladesh or Brooklyn from my home country. And I wondered if our movement to engage men can almost replace or fulfill that sense of belonging that men from marginalized communities, be they Dalit or Brooklyn, if we can fill that by making these men welcome with us in working to stop violence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's take one more, and then over here. Okay.
Thank you all. As usual, super depressing. Even more so than the last couple of days. But I wanted to ask, I take, and I agree with the point, right, that, I don't know, sexual violence is deeply embedded in sort of class inequalities and corporate issues, and so how are we to go about dealing with that? Like just to take Shakti Mills as an example, for example, right? Like, what do we do as feminists, and other than to do what you're doing, and I'm interested in to point it out, like, where might some interventions lie in this?
Where might some intervention?
Okay, let's take one. There was one here. Mm-hmm. Okay, one here.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentations. One is comment and one is a little bit of query. Comment is linked more. I mean, I have been fortunate that I was in Rio and now looking at this gathering and discussions. So how this journey has really come a long way. And especially when we are talking about that the whole notions and whole discourse on masculinities should not be on the cost of destabilizing the gender discourse, which I learned from Deena ji. I mean, this is really a great thing. Just Deena ji, when we were talking about, individual and the structure. Individual responsibilities are there, but at the same time, looking the individual in the larger structure. But just to get more insight, like where we put this responsibility when you say like, okay, individual is the change agent basically at the same time. But also taking away this thing by saying, okay, structures are there. So this is something, just to get more insight on this, a kind of a confusion basically. This is in my mind. Basically. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. This gentleman? Yeah. So this is the final one, I think, because we're out of time.
Sí. Bueno, yo voy a hablar en español, pero mi compañero me va a traducir en inglés. Sobre todo quería hacer un comentario, ¿no? Escuchándolos, yo entiendo que hay como tres elementos que en lo que nosotros hacemos debemos considerar, ¿no? El capitalismo, la colonialidad del poder y el patriarcado, ¿no? Son tres sistemas de opresión, ¿no? Que están latentes y creo yo que no debemos descuidar ninguno de los tres en las luchas que hacemos, ¿no? Y creo que después de este simposio debemos sin temor, ¿no? Sin miedo plantear, ¿no? un pronunciamiento que vaya en esos tres horizontes, ¿no? El capitalismo, la descolonialidad del poder y el antipatriarcado, ¿no? Y nosotros necesitamos justamente llevar el debate más allá de solamente cuestionar al hombre o al hombre patriarca, ¿no? Sino más bien cómo nosotros planteamos nuevos modelos epistemológicos, estéticos, éticos, políticos, que nos lleven hacia el cuestionamiento de esos tres elementos, ¿no? Ser capaz de apostar, ¿no? Por modelos que cuestionen el actual modelo de desarrollo, ¿no? Una apuesta emancipatoria que vaya sobre apuesta por la solidaridad, una apuesta desde la intimidad, desde la colectividad, y cómo nosotros desde nuestro trabajo debemos apostar por esos tres elementos sin quedarnos solamente en cuestionar, ¿no? El tema patriarcal, sino también cómo están estos tres elementos íntimamente ligados, ¿no? En todo caso, cómo nosotros estamos pensando esa posibilidad.
There are three elements. Jacob is saying that there are three elements important that we have to take into account. Three forms of oppression, three systems of oppression. One is capitalism. Patriarchy is the other. And the third one, the third one, actually, I can't. Colonialism, power. And we don't have to, we have to include the three of them. We have to, we should not only question the patriarchal male, but we also have to question all of this form of system of power and invent new models for social struggle. We have to come up with an emancipatory proposal that include all of them.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm being told we have to close this session because we're already over 5 minutes over and they want to stick to time. But let me just say that those are great questions. We had a question about can men find a home in the movement, particularly dispossessed and marginalized men. The question about how do we work on these linked struggles. And we've had this thing about we need to do it right. Well, what does it mean to do it right with a working class black man in Brooklyn? What does it mean to do it right with a Dalit man in India? And I think what we can continue after the break in the discussion then is some of those questions about strategy. So I'll hand over to thank the panelists.